Hi, my name is Joseph Firetog. I'm a research fellow based at ODI in London, and I'm delighted to present here today at the IEA World Congress, albeit virtually. I'll be presenting some of our research on perceptions of tenure security and the relationship between tenure security and broader development outcomes as defined by the SDGs. To start off with, it's worth pointing out that land economics very much sits at the heart of development economics, always has, and as a result, land tenure and the security of it also sits at the heart of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And although you can probably find a reference to land in every one of the 17 SDGs, including life underwater, there are just 4 that I want to concentrate on as part of this presentation. The first 2 include measures of tenure security as part of global efforts to track them. I've referred to them simplistically as economic and social development goals. The first is SDG 142, aimed at eradicating poverty, and the second is 5A1, which considers asset ownership, especially of agricultural land, as a pathway towards achieving gender equality. There are 2 further SDGs for which land is very important. The third captures governance under SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. And the fourth is SDG 15, which covers life on land and thereby environmental outcomes. And obviously, there are a host of other development goals that for which land is very important, but that I can't cover within the constraints of this presentation, including things like food security or sustainable cities. So let's start with economic development. This is probably the most developed way of thinking about tenure security and its development potential. And there's extensive literature and evidence of secure land and property rights being recognized as a fundamental precondition for economic growth and development. That research has mostly taken place at the micro level and predominantly investigates the impact of rural land tenure security on economic outcomes, mainly by the mechanism of agricultural investment. So to highlight Tim Besley's seminal work in 1995, that shows how secure land tenure can increase investment incentives, be it by reducing risks associated with investments that are fixed in land, or by improving access to credit, or by enabling the value of investments to be recouped in the event of a sale in a more developed land market. And there is, following that study, there has been lots of evidence, especially of the investment mechanism, the first one in particular, probably less so for the credit pathway. That's what's argued by Stephen Laurie in a relatively recent systematic review. And one of the main issues that's identified in these studies is that tenure security, which is something that's very complex to frame and to capture, is not always conceptualized and operationalized consistently. Van Gelder, for instance, notes that tenure security is often used to refer to 3 distinct concepts, the first being perceptions of risks to tenure, the second being the legal status of tenure, and the third, the extent to which the right holder's tenure is threatened in practice, so their de facto rights. This ambiguity, he argues, hinders the debate. And I've got another slide here, but I'm not going to go through it, but just to say that these complexities can partly be resolved by using subjective data, and that's what Prindex does. Prindex, for instance, conceptualizes tenure security as the degree of certainty against eviction or expropriation, either in full or in part, and over a limited time frame of 5 years. And that definition is consistent with most commonly used conceptualizations relating to certainty about rights, including Tim Besley's work and global efforts to track tenure security under SDGs 142 and 5A1. But just to say that there are other measures out there, such as ones in the diagram here. At a macro level, we found that the results of the Prindex survey do correlate with economic development indicators. There is, for instance, a strong relationship between the share of people who feel secure and the share of people who don't have enough money for food or shelter, or those that are in extreme poverty. There's also a strong correlation between tenure security and inequality, captured, for instance, using the Gini index. But there's less of a correlation between tenure security and broad economic measures, such as GDP per capita. And that's important to highlight because economic growth does not always go hand in hand with tenure security. And I'll list just 2 very prominent examples here. One is when economic growth goes hand in hand with rapidly increasing land and property values, and that can lead to processes such as gentrification, which can price people out of their land and property. And the second is the expansion of rental markets, and that's often associated with urbanization, which in turn is associated with economic development. That highlights for us an increased attention for policy protection to protect land and property rights, especially in the context of rapid economic growth. Turning to social progress, the link between tenure security and social progress has mostly been analyzed by looking at its impact on gender equality. So the idea here is that strengthening women's access to land not only increases their access to productive assets, which can be used, for instance, to escape poverty, but it may also change their standing within the household or the community and thereby empower them. And gender equality is actually now considered one of the primary objectives of donor-funded land tenure programs around the world. However, and here's the issue, the SDG indicator, which is also obviously used by Prindex, may not fully capture women's experiences of tenure security. And we actually discovered that using the Prindex data itself. So and this has been noted by several authors, that the biggest threat to women's tenure security is internal. It comes from within the household or the community, and it predominantly manifests itself during changes to the family structure or to the social structure. Those changes won't necessarily be captured within the 5-year horizon, simply because they're in many cases unpredictable. So for instance, we asked a question about men and women's experiences of tenure security during hypothetical divorce and spousal death scenarios. And although the difference between men and women's tenure security overall, using the 5-year horizon question, is minimal, the divergence opens up when you look at those spousal death and divorce scenarios. That's something that's really, really important to consider going forward, especially when tracking progress against the SDGs. A lesser explored link that I'd like to cover very briefly in this presentation is the link between tenure security and social capital or well-being. It's especially important within the context of COVID-19, I think, because for many of us, the relationship between with land has changed as part of COVID-19. For instance, for those of us lucky enough to work from home, it's become stronger. And that really shows you how tenure security can influence your well-being, your happiness. And that's also becoming increasingly important for people and for governments. And the data actually shows that there are some strong correlations between tenure security and the share of people who experience worry or anger. But the problem is that there could be reverse causality here, and we need to explore this further using time series or panel data. Third, turning to governance, we find strong correlations between tenure security and various governance indicators, including the World Bank's. But one of the strongest is between Prindex and Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. We know that if there is no trust in land governance systems, for instance, because of widespread corruption, there can be very little confidence in land and property rights, especially where formal property rights are widespread. So if we just look at countries where land markets are very well developed, such as the Americas, Europe, or parts of Asia and North Africa, you can see that the correlation becomes even stronger. However, there is a massive chicken and egg problem here, excuse the phrasing, but because while secure tenure is often considered a precondition for economic and social development, it may actually be the other way around for governance. And trustworthy governance systems might actually be a precondition for tenure security. On the other hand, if you look at this from a public finance perspective, for instance, you might argue that's the other way around. You need tenure security to for instance, collect taxes on land and property and strengthen the capacity of governance systems. So there are really complicated mutual and self-reinforcing relationships here. There are also other ways of looking at the relationship between tenure security and social progress or governance, including the effects, its relationship with wider instability, violence, and conflict. Another area which has actually been part of the research agenda for a long time but deserves more attention is the role of customary land governance systems and the way in which they can award tenure security even where formal systems are or become dysfunctional. Finally, I want to consider the fourth spectrum, which is the relationship between tenure security and environmental outcomes. Probably the most important, but least developed in terms of our thinking. So traditionally, the relationship between land tenure and environmental protection has been very simple. It involves protecting large swaths of land as part of national parks or as conservation areas, and therefore protecting the natural resources within it. This also involves protection of community rights, particularly of indigenous peoples. But over the last decade or so, there's been a real progress in thinking about this in a different way. And that's largely been the result of REDD or REDD Plus programs, which seek to reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation. Many of these involve interventions that seek to provide economic incentives for sustainable land use practices. And I think that's a really important way of thinking about it, rather than thinking about it separately. So if you think about environmental outcomes alongside the other three, economic, social, and governance indicators, you can see how they can go hand in hand. And that's really important. Because if we don't consider that, we actually risk going backwards. So a good example of this is where tenure security increases incentives to investment in land productively, and that leads to economic gains, such as increased agricultural productivity. This may be associated with negative environmental outcomes. For instance, if the agricultural productivity involves intensification, that can be damaging to biodiversity, or if it involves extensification, that could lead to deforestation. So it's essential that we, especially governments consider policies and incentive structures that prevent this from happening. And the social impact is important as well. So we've been looking at studies that show that increasing women's tenure security is often associated with behavior that increases resilience to climate change or even mitigates the impacts of it. Methodologically, there is a challenge, and that is how to combine geospatial with anonymized individual or household level data. So to conclude, the link between tenure security and economic development outcomes is probably the most developed, but more consistency and caution is needed when measuring tenure security. When it comes to social progress, measures of tenure security need to be adjusted to incorporate experiences of women, and further analysis of the links between tenure security and well-being are required. Third, the relationship between governance and tenure security is relatively well understood, but caution is needed in assessing the reverse causality of that relationship. And then finally, there's relatively little understanding of how land tenure security at a micro level links to environmental outcomes. However, overlap exists between economic, social, and governance outcomes that requires further research. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the panel and also the rest of the Congress. Take care and bye.